To my mom, the woman who funded half our lives, my son said as he lifted his champagne glass in front of nearly 50 guests, his smile polished and confident beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Lakeshore Country Club ballroom. Laughter rolled softly across the room. I smiled too, because after 68 years of life, I had learned that humiliation delivered in public was usually disguised as humor. But then Daniel leaned back in his chair, loosened his tie slightly, and added the sentence that made something inside my chest turn cold. Honestly, she's basically our personal ATM. This time the laughter came louder, sharper. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances before forcing polite smiles back onto their faces. Vanessa laughed hardest of all. My daughter-in-law rested her manicured hand on Daniel's arm like she was proud of him for saying it. Proud of him for turning his own mother into the punchline of the evening. I kept my smile in place and lowered my eyes toward the untouched slice of sea salt caramel cake sitting in front of me. The gold engagement decorations shimmered under the warm lights while a jazz trio played softly near the dance floor. Everything about the night looked elegant. Expensive floral arrangements, imported champagne, white roses hanging from crystal stands, and almost all of it had been paid for by me. I adjusted the pearl bracelet on my wrist and pretended not to notice the way several guests were now looking at me with sympathy instead of respect. The strange thing about growing older is that people slowly stop seeing you as a person. You become a resource, a retirement account, a spare bedroom, a signature on paperwork. Daniel had not always been this way. When he was little, he used to run into my arms after school and tell me every detail about his day before I could even take off my coat from work. Back then, I was simply Mom. Not an ATM, not a wallet with gray hair, just Mom. You know she loves taking care of us, Vanessa added smoothly as a waiter refreshed her wine glass. Margaret would probably feel lonely if we stopped letting her help. A few guests chuckled politely again. I heard someone whisper, "Must be nice," from the next table. I looked around the ballroom slowly. At the designer dresses, the polished silverware, the giant ice sculpture shaped like intertwined wedding rings. Daniel and Vanessa looked beautiful sitting together beneath the soft amber lighting. Successful, admired, untouchable. And suddenly I realized something painful. They were no longer embarrassed to use me. They were comfortable doing it publicly now. That was the part that hurt most. Not the money, not even the joke. It was the ease in his voice when he said it. As though reducing his own mother to a bank account felt completely natural. Daniel raised his glass again toward the guests. Seriously though, none of this would have happened without Mom's checkbook. More laughter, more clinking glasses. I nodded once and lifted my champagne carefully to my lips, though I didn't drink. Inside my purse beside my chair rested a folded copy of Harold Bennett's letter, the one my late husband's attorney had hand-delivered to me 3 days earlier. Daniel had no idea that his father changed the family trust 6 months before he died. He had no idea certain conditions had been added. And as I watched my son smile proudly beneath the ballroom lights while strangers laughed at his joke about me, I realized something else too. My husband must have seen this coming long before I did. 3 days earlier, I had stood alone in my kitchen carefully wrapping an engagement gift in silver paper while rain tapped softly against the windows above the sink. The house felt too quiet without Thomas. Even after 4 years, I still caught myself expecting to hear his footsteps coming down the hallway every morning at exactly 6:30. He had always been the first one awake. Always the one who brewed coffee before I even opened my eyes. Now the coffee maker hummed in silence while I folded ribbon around a crystal serving tray Vanessa had casually mentioned wanting months ago during lunch. She had laughed when she said it. Nobody buys quality pieces anymore. Everything people gift us is cheap. At the time, I pretended not to notice the way she glanced directly at me afterward. I spent nearly $400 on that tray because I wanted the evening to feel perfect. Because somewhere deep inside me, I still believed effort could preserve family. The rain grew heavier outside as I placed the gift beside 2 garment bags hanging near the dining room. One held my navy blue dress. The other held a wool coat Thomas bought me during our trip to Vermont 15 years ago. I still remembered him fastening the buttons himself because my hands had been cold from the snow. "You always look elegant in blue," he had whispered back then. Some memories age softly. Others become sharper with time. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter just as I finished tying the ribbon. "Vanessa," I smiled before answering. still foolish enough to think warmth existed between us somewhere underneath all the polished smiles and careful remarks. "Margaret, quick question," she said brightly. "Did you already mail the check for the florist upgrade?" I looked down at the envelope sitting beside my purse. "I was planning to bring it Friday night." "Perfect," she replied immediately. "You are a lifesaver. Honestly, I do not know what we would do without you." The sentence should have sounded loving. Instead, something about it settled heavily in my chest. There was a pause before she continued. "Oh, and Daniel mentioned maybe talking to you soon about helping with the lake house down payment too. Nothing urgent. Of course. Another payment. Another rescue. Another quiet transfer from my savings account into their beautiful life. We can discuss it later," I answered softly. Vanessa laughed lightly. "You always take care of everything." After we hung up, I remained standing there for a long moment staring at the rain sliding down the windows. I tried to remember the last time Daniel had called simply to ask how I was doing. Not because of invoices, not because of event costs, not because something needed fixing financially. I could not remember. That realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. I walked slowly into the living room where framed photographs lined the fireplace mantel. Daniel at 8 years old holding a baseball trophy. Daniel graduating college in his dark green cap and gown. Daniel dancing with me at his wedding while Vanessa smiled for photographers nearby. In every picture, I looked proud, happy, necessary. The problem with being needed for too long is that eventually people stop seeing the difference between love and usefulness. Later that evening, Harold Bennett called unexpectedly. Thomas had trusted Harold for nearly 40 years. His voice always carried the calm steadiness of someone who already knew more than he intended to say. "Margaret," he began carefully, "there is something regarding the family trust one believe you should review before Friday's engagement dinner." I frowned slightly. "Is something wrong?" There was a silence on the other end before he answered. "Your husband made certain revisions shortly before his passing. Revisions he specifically instructed me not to discuss unless circumstances changed." I tightened my grip on the phone. "What kind of circumstances?" Harold exhaled quietly. "The kind where respect within a family begins disappearing." The morning of the engagement dinner arrived cold and bright, with pale November sunlight spilling across the hardwood floors of my living room. I woke earlier than usual after another restless night and stood quietly beside the bedroom window, holding a cup of coffee between my hands. Outside, the maple trees lining my street had almost completely lost their leaves. A few golden ones still clung stubbornly to the branches, trembling every time the wind moved through them. Thomas used to say late autumn was honest because nothing pretended to stay alive longer than it should. I thought about those words while staring at the empty side of the bed beside me. The house remained painfully neat these days. Too neat. No newspaper folded on the kitchen table. No reading glasses left beside the couch. No low humming from the study while Thomas balanced accounts late at night. Just silence stretching from room to room like a second skin. Around 10 o'clock, Daniel called. His voice sounded rushed and distracted, like someone multitasking through the conversation. "Mom, do not forget the florist check tonight," he said before even asking how I was feeling. "Vanessa is stressed enough already." I leaned against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes briefly. "Good morning to you too, Daniel." There was a short pause. "Sorry. Good morning. We are just buried in final details over here." Buried. Such an interesting word considering how quickly people bury gratitude once they become comfortable receiving help. "I have the check ready," I answered calmly. "Wonderful," he replied immediately, relief flooding his tone faster than warmth ever did anymore. "Honestly, you always save us." Then he laughed lightly before adding, "I swear, you are the only reason these events ever happen." Again, the same pattern. Praise attached directly to money. Appreciation connected only to usefulness. After we hung up, I remained standing there listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Slowly, memories began surfacing one after another like puzzle pieces finally fitting together. Daniel calling me 2 years ago because they were short on mortgage payments after overspending on a kitchen renovation. Vanessa crying softly at my dining table while explaining how difficult private school tuition had become for their daughter. The emergency business loan during the pandemic. The luxury SUV they insisted was necessary because of Daniel's professional image. Every crisis somehow ended with my checkbook opening. And every time I convinced myself that family simply helped family. Around noon, I drove to Lakeshore Country Club to drop off the florist envelope early. The ballroom buzzed with activity as workers arranged flowers and polished champagne glasses beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. Vanessa stood near the stage holding a clipboard while directing staff members with polished confidence. She spotted me immediately and smiled the same perfect smile she always used around other people. "Margaret, thank goodness you are here," she said while air-kissing my cheek. "You have no idea how much pressure we are under." I handed her the envelope. "Everything looks beautiful." "Well, beauty is expensive," she replied with a small laugh while slipping the check into her designer handbag without opening it. Then her eyes drifted toward a group of women standing near the bar. "Sometimes I think you are the only one who understands how important appearances are." One of the women nearby smiled at Vanessa and joked, "Must be nice having family support like that." Vanessa laughed softly before answering, "Margaret does not mind. Taking care of us gives her purpose." The sentence landed harder than she realized. Or maybe she realized it perfectly. I could not tell anymore. My chest tightened slightly, but I kept my expression calm while adjusting the sleeve of my coat. Across the ballroom, I noticed several guests glance toward me with those same careful smiles people use around someone fragile, someone aging, someone useful but no longer fully seen. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. I was not. They had all quietly agreed on my role long ago. I was not family at the center of their lives. I was financial stability wrapped in pearls and politeness. And somewhere deep down, I think Thomas understood that long before I ever allowed myself to see it. That evening, after leaving the country club, I drove home slowly through streets glowing with early Christmas lights. The town looked beautiful in the cold November dusk. White lights wrapped around porch railings, wreaths hanging from front doors, families gathering inside warm dining rooms while soft yellow light spilled through windows onto quiet sidewalks. I used to love this season. Thomas loved it even more. He believed holidays were not about decorations or gifts, but about people choosing each other over and over again despite everything life put in the way. Somewhere along the line, our family had stopped choosing me unless money was involved. The realization followed me all the way home. Inside the house, the silence greeted me immediately. I placed my purse carefully on the kitchen counter and removed my coat slowly, listening to the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Thomas bought that clock during our 25th anniversary trip to Charleston. He said he liked the sound because it reminded him that time deserved to be noticed while it was passing. I poured myself a small glass of water and stood in the dark kitchen without turning on the lights. Outside, rain had started again, tapping softly against the windows just like it had 3 nights earlier. My eyes drifted toward the framed photograph sitting near the stove. Thomas and me at Daniel's college graduation. Thomas had one arm around our son, while Daniel smiled proudly in his cap and gown. Back then, he still looked at us with gratitude instead of expectation. I picked up the frame gently, and memories came rushing back with painful clarity. Daniel at 23 years old sitting at this very kitchen table, overwhelmed by student loans and terrified about his future. "I do not know how I am supposed to start a life carrying this much debt," he had admitted quietly while staring into his coffee cup. Thomas and I exchanged one look before deciding together. We emptied nearly half our retirement savings to help him start fresh. Daniel cried that night, actual tears running down his face as he hugged us both. "I swear I will never forget this," he whispered. Years later came the down payment for his first house. Then the emergency business loan after one of his investors backed out unexpectedly. Then private school tuition for our granddaughter because Vanessa insisted public schools would limit opportunities. Every single time, Daniel promised it was temporary. Every single time, Thomas told me quietly afterward, "We need to be careful that helping does not become enabling." I remember brushing those concerns aside. "He is our son," I would answer. "Family takes care of family." Thomas never argued with me directly. That was not his way. But over the years, I began noticing the way his expression changed after certain phone calls. The long silences after Daniel requested money. The way he stared out windows afterward with disappointment he rarely put into words. About 6 months before he passed away, Thomas and I sat together on the back patio one cool spring evening watching birds settle into the trees beyond our yard. His health had already begun declining by then, though neither of us wanted to admit how serious things were becoming. He reached for my hand and held it quietly for a long moment before speaking. "Margaret," he said softly, "promise me something." I looked over at him. "What is it?" His eyes stayed fixed on the yard instead of me. "If the day ever comes when they stop loving you and start measuring you by what you can provide, promise me you will walk away before they destroy your dignity." At the time, I thought he was simply worried about finances after he was gone. I squeezed his hand and smiled gently. Daniel would never treat me that way. Thomas looked at me, then with an expression I understand only now. Not anger, not bitterness, just sadness mixed with acceptance. Like a man watching a storm form long before anyone else notices the clouds. Standing alone in my dark kitchen years later, I finally realized he had not been afraid of losing money. He had been afraid of me losing myself. The engagement dinner officially began at 7 o'clock, but by 6:30 the ballroom was already glowing with expensive warmth and practiced perfection. Servers moved silently between tables carrying silver trays of champagne, while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers in the ceiling. Vanessa stood near the entrance greeting guests with effortless elegance, her pale gold dress catching the light every time she turned. Daniel remained close beside her, shaking hands, smiling confidently, looking every bit like the successful businessman he had spent years trying to become. I watched them from my table near the back corner of the room, while slowly stirring a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. At some point during the evening, Evelyn Carter slipped quietly into the chair beside me. Evelyn had been my closest friend for more than 30 years. She was one of the few people left who still spoke to me like I was Margaret instead of someone's mother or someone's source of financial rescue. "You look tired," she said gently while placing her purse beneath the table. I forced a small smile. "Long week." Evelyn glanced across the ballroom toward Daniel and Vanessa before lowering her voice slightly. "I heard the joke earlier." I looked down at the untouched coffee in front of me. People laughed. "Some people laugh because they are uncomfortable," she replied calmly. "Others laugh because they agree." Her words settled heavily between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Around us, crystal glasses clinked softly while guests admired flower arrangements and complimented the catering. Everything sounded polished, refined. But beneath it all, I felt something slowly unraveling. Evelyn leaned slightly closer. "Margaret, may I ask you something honestly?" I nodded. "When was the last time Daniel visited you without needing something?" The question caught me off guard because the answer arrived immediately. I simply did not want to admit it. My eyes drifted toward the dance floor, where Daniel laughed loudly beside two business associates, while Vanessa touched his arm possessively. They looked happy, relaxed, untouched by guilt. "He is busy," I answered quietly. Even to my own ears, it sounded weak. Evelyn sighed softly. "You are still protecting him." I folded my hands carefully in my lap. "He is my son." "Yes," she replied gently. "But you are his mother, not his retirement plan." I stared at the flickering candle in the center of the table, while something inside me tightened painfully. The hardest truths are usually the ones repeated softly instead of loudly. Evelyn reached into her purse and pulled out a folded napkin before smoothing it absent-mindedly between her fingers. "I did not want to say anything before tonight," she continued carefully, "but I overheard Vanessa speaking to one of her friends during the bridal shower last month." My stomach tightened slightly. "About what?" Evelyn hesitated before answering. "About your house. About how much property values in your neighborhood have increased over the past few years." My fingers stopped moving against my coffee cup. What exactly did she say? Evelyn looked directly at me then. She said once certain things were finalized, you would probably be happier somewhere smaller and easier to manage. I felt cold despite the warmth inside the ballroom. Smaller, easier to manage. The kind of phrases people use when discussing furniture they plan to move. Not family. Across the room, Vanessa suddenly laughed at something one of the guests said. Her smile looked flawless beneath the chandeliers. Daniel wrapped an arm around her waist while another waiter approached them with champagne. Neither of them looked toward me even once. Evelyn placed her hand gently over mine. "Margaret," she said quietly, "some people slowly stop seeing kindness as kindness. Eventually they begin seeing it as access." I swallowed carefully and looked down at the gold wedding band I still wore beside my engagement ring. Thomas warned me years ago. Harold warned me 3 days ago. And now Evelyn sat beside me confirming the same painful truth from a completely different direction. Suddenly the room no longer felt elegant. It felt transactional, like every smile had a price attached to it somewhere. By the time dinner plates were cleared from the tables, the ballroom had grown louder with wine, laughter, and the comfortable arrogance that often settles over wealthy people near the end of expensive evenings. Couples drifted toward the dance floor while older guests gathered near the bar discussing vacation homes, stock markets, and grandchildren attending Ivy League schools. I remained seated beside Evelyn, quietly watching the room move around me like a performance I no longer belonged inside. At 8:45, my phone vibrated softly inside my purse. Harold Bennett. I excused myself from the table and stepped into the long marble hallway outside the ballroom, where everything suddenly became still and quiet. The muffled sound of music echoed faintly behind the closed doors while soft wall sconces cast warm pools of light across the empty corridor. "Margaret," Harold said gently after I answered. "I hope I am not interrupting." "No," I replied softly. I needed air anyway. There was a brief pause before he continued. "I reviewed the trust documents again this afternoon. Thomas left very specific instructions regarding your protection." I leaned against the wall slowly, tightening my hand around the phone. "You keep using that word. Protection." Harold exhaled quietly. "Because your husband believed there might come a time when certain people around you would mistake generosity for weakness." My eyes drifted toward the ballroom doors at the far end of the hallway. Through the narrow glass panels, I could see Daniel laughing with a group of guests while Vanessa stood beside him holding another glass of champagne. Beautiful people inside a beautiful room built partially from my sacrifices. "Harold," I asked carefully, "what exactly did Thomas change?" His voice lowered slightly. 6 months before he passed, he added a behavioral clause to the family trust. I frowned. "A behavioral clause?" "Yes. If any direct beneficiary publicly humiliates, manipulates, financially exploits, or attempts to isolate you for personal financial gain, their inheritance rights may be permanently revoked." The hallway suddenly felt colder. I closed my eyes briefly while the words settled heavily into place. Publicly humiliates, financially exploits, isolates. Thomas had not written those words by accident. He really thought things would become that bad? I whispered. Harold remained silent for a moment before answering carefully. "Margaret, your husband noticed patterns long before you did." A painful ache rose slowly inside my chest. Not because Thomas had prepared for betrayal, but because I now understood how long he must have worried about me in silence. "There is something else," Harold added gently. "You are the sole acting authority over the trust while you are alive. No transfers, property sales, or access requests can happen without your direct written approval." My eyes opened slowly. Meaning? Meaning no one can force you out of your home. No one can pressure you into restructuring assets. And no one receives a single dollar unless you choose it. I swallowed carefully as memories from earlier in the evening replayed inside my mind. Vanessa joking that helping them gave me purpose. Daniel calling me their personal ATM while guests laughed around crystal glasses and candlelight. The humiliation suddenly looked different now. Smaller somehow. Less powerful. Because for the first time all evening, I understood something they did not. They believed my silence came from dependence. They had no idea it came from restraint. "Thank you, Harold," I said quietly. "Thomas loved you very much, Margaret," he replied. Softly. "Everything he did at the end was meant to preserve your dignity after he was gone." After the call ended, I remained alone in the hallway for several minutes listening to the distant music from the ballroom. Then the doors opened suddenly, and Vanessa stepped out holding her phone against her chest. She stopped when she saw me standing there. "Margaret," she said with surprise before smiling smoothly again. "There you are. Daniel was wondering where you disappeared to." I slipped my phone calmly back into my purse. I needed a moment. Vanessa nodded sympathetically, though her eyes moved briefly toward my handbag before returning to my face. "You know," she said lightly, "Daniel worries about you being alone so much these days. We have actually been discussing ways to simplify things for you moving forward." Simplify things. Again, that same careful language. Controlled. Polished. Dangerous precisely because it sounded kind. I looked at her quietly beneath the warm hallway lights, and for the first time since Thomas died, I stopped seeing my daughter-in-law as merely selfish. I finally saw her clearly for what she truly was. Strategic. When Vanessa and I returned to the ballroom, Dessert had already been served, and the atmosphere had shifted into that relaxed stage of the evening where people spoke louder, laughed easier, and revealed more than they intended. Candlelight flickered across half-empty wine glasses while the jazz trio near the dance floor transitioned into slower music. Daniel spotted us immediately and raised his hand toward me with the same casual confidence he used during business presentations. "There she is," he called out warmly as several guests turned toward us. "The woman keeping this family financially afloat." More laughter followed, softer this time, but still enough to tighten something inside my chest. I smiled politely and returned to my seat without correcting him. That was the strange thing about humiliation repeated often enough. Eventually, the people around you stop recognizing it as cruelty and begin treating it like personality. Vanessa settled beside Daniel while he draped an arm across the back of her chair. Across the table, one of Daniel's business partners leaned forward with a grin. "You are lucky," the man said. "Most parents cut their kids off after college." Daniel laughed and took another sip of bourbon. "My mom is old school. She believes family money stays in the family." He said it casually, comfortably, like someone discussing investment portfolios instead of a living person sitting 3 feet away from him. I lowered my eyes toward the dessert plate in front of me and gently folded my napkin. No anger rose inside me anymore. Only clarity, the kind that arrives quietly after years of ignoring obvious truths. As conversations continued around the table, I noticed things I might once have missed. Every time someone mentioned property values or investments, Vanessa listened carefully. Every time Daniel referenced future plans, he spoke as though my resources were already part of his possession. "Once we expand into Naples," he said confidently to another guest, "everything changes for us financially." Us, not him, not their marriage. Their future already included assets that did not belong to them. At one point, Vanessa leaned close to Daniel and whispered something near his ear. He nodded slightly before glancing toward me. The look lasted only a second, but I recognized it immediately. Assessment. Calculation. Not affection. "Mom," Daniel said suddenly, turning back toward me with a bright smile, "we should probably sit down next week and review everything together." I tilted my head slightly. "Review what?" "Your long-term plans," Vanessa answered smoothly before he could continue. "We just want to make sure things are simplified for you moving forward." There was that word again. Simplified. Like my life was paperwork waiting to be organized by younger hands. "You know how overwhelming home maintenance can become," Daniel added casually. "Especially alone." I stared at him quietly for a moment. This was the same boy who once cried because he could not sleep unless I checked his closet for monsters before bed. Now he spoke to me with the careful patience people use on strangers they consider fragile. "My house is doing just fine," I replied calmly. Vanessa smiled. Quickly, but the expression never reached her eyes. "Of course it is. We are only thinking ahead because we care." Care. Another beautiful word people ruin when money becomes involved. Before I could answer, one of the servers approached with fresh coffee. As he poured mine, I noticed Harold Bennett entering quietly through the ballroom doors at the far end of the room. He wore his usual dark gray suit and carried a slim leather folder tucked beneath one arm. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. Strange how fear disappears once truth finally becomes visible. Daniel noticed Harold too and frowned slightly with confusion. "Why is Dad's attorney here?" he asked lightly. Vanessa turned in her chair to look across the ballroom, and for the first time that evening, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not panic exactly, but alertness, instinctive caution. Harold's eyes met mine briefly from across the room before he gave a small, respectful nod. In that moment, surrounded by chandeliers, polished silver, and people who believed they understood my place in this family, I suddenly realized something important. They all thought the evening belonged to them. None of them understood the balance of power had already begun shifting hours ago. Harold moved through the ballroom slowly, stopping occasionally to shake hands with a few older guests who recognized him from charity boards and estate dinners over the years. His calm presence contrasted sharply with the restless energy now building beneath the surface of our table. Daniel sat straighter in his chair the moment Harold approached. Vanessa's smile remained perfectly arranged, but I noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her wine glass. People reveal themselves most honestly through the small movements they cannot fully control. "Harold," Daniel said as the attorney reached our table, This is unexpected. Harold nodded politely. Good evening, Daniel. Vanessa. Then his attention shifted toward me. Margaret. There was warmth in his voice when he said my name. Genuine warmth. Something I suddenly realized I had not heard much from my own family lately. I hope I am not. Interrupting the celebration, Harold continued smoothly. Not at all. Vanessa answered quickly before Daniel could speak. Please sit down. Harold thanked her and took the empty chair beside me, while several nearby guests watched with quiet curiosity. Attorneys rarely appear unexpectedly at family celebrations without reason. I folded my hands calmly in my lap while the jazz trio continued playing near the dance floor. Around us, conversations resumed cautiously, though I could feel attention drifting toward our table in subtle waves. Daniel forced a polite smile. So what brings you here tonight? Harold adjusted the cuff of his jacket before answering. Actually, I needed to discuss a trust matter with Margaret. The word trust changed the atmosphere instantly. I saw it happen in Daniel's face before he could hide it. A brief flicker of alertness. Calculation. Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression still pleasant but far more attentive now. A trust matter? Daniel repeated carefully. Harold nodded. Nothing alarming. Thomas simply left several administrative matters requiring periodic review. Thomas. Even years after his death, his name still carried quiet authority inside this family. Daniel glanced toward me. Mom, is something wrong? I met his eyes calmly. No, everything is perfectly fine. And for the first time in a very long time, I actually meant it. One of the guests nearby attempted to lighten the mood with a joke about lawyers always appearing when money was involved. Several people laughed softly, but the sound felt strained now. The evening's easy confidence had shifted into something more cautious, more observant. Harold opened the slim leather folder resting on his lap and removed several documents. He did not hand them to anyone. He simply reviewed them quietly, while Daniel watched with increasing tension disguised beneath polite curiosity. Vanessa reached for her champagne again, but barely drank from it. You know, Daniel said casually after a moment, Mom and I were actually planning to sit down soon and organize some long-term family planning ourselves. Harold looked up slowly. Is that so? Of course, Vanessa added smoothly. We only want to help Margaret simplify things moving forward. There was that word again. Simplify. Harold closed the folder gently and rested one hand over it. In my experience, he said calmly, people often use the word simplify when they really mean transfer control. Silence settled briefly across the table. Not dramatic silence. Worse, controlled silence. The kind where everyone hears the warning beneath the politeness. Daniel laughed lightly, though the sound no longer came naturally. I think we are all on the same side here. Harold's expression remained neutral. Families usually believe that right before inheritance disputes begin. Vanessa's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. I remained completely still beside him, listening carefully while the room continued glowing around us with candlelight and expensive floral arrangements. Earlier that evening, I had felt humiliated sitting at this same table. Small, diminished. But now something else had replaced those feelings. Perspective. Because for the first time, I was no longer the only person in the room quietly observing Daniel and Vanessa. Someone else saw them clearly too. Daniel cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair. Well, whatever paperwork exists, I am sure Mom trusts us completely. Harold turned toward him slowly. Trust, he replied softly, is exactly what your father was most concerned about before he died. The sentence landed harder than any raised voice ever could. And suddenly, for the first time all evening, Daniel stopped smiling. The atmosphere at the table never fully recovered after Harold's last sentence. Conversations around us resumed eventually, but quieter now, as though everyone sensed something uncomfortable moving beneath the polished surface of the evening. Daniel tried several times to steer discussions back toward business and wedding plans, yet the confidence in his voice had changed. Tiny cracks had appeared. The kind people miss unless they know someone well enough to notice when a smile becomes effort instead of instinct. I noticed. Vanessa noticed too. She barely touched her champagne after that. Around 10 o'clock, guests began, drifting toward the valet entrance beneath the soft glow of hanging lanterns outside the ballroom. Coats appeared. Farewells echoed politely through the room. I remained seated while Harold reviewed one final document quietly beside me. Daniel approached our table with his hands in his pockets and forced another easy smile. Mom, are you heading home soon? In a little while, I answered calmly. Good, he replied. I was thinking maybe next week we could all meet for dinner somewhere quieter and really discuss long-term planning together. Harold closed the folder slowly before I could answer. What exactly requires discussion? Daniel's jaw tightened for half a second. Nothing dramatic. I just want to make sure Mom is protected moving forward. Protected. Another carefully chosen word. People become very creative with language when money hides underneath conversations. Vanessa stepped closer and rested a hand lightly on Daniel's arm. We only worry because managing a large property alone can become overwhelming at Margaret's age. At Margaret's age. Not my age. Not 68. Just old enough to sound fragile when discussed publicly. Harold adjusted his glasses calmly. Margaret appears perfectly capable of managing her own affairs. Vanessa laughed softly, though her eyes remained sharp. Of course she is. We are simply trying to help before things become difficult unexpectedly. The sentence might have sounded caring to strangers listening nearby, but I finally heard the machinery underneath every polished word. Pressure disguised as concern. Control disguised as assistance. Daniel looked toward me again. Mom, nobody is trying to upset you. We just think simplifying your assets now would make life easier later. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate before standing slowly from the table. Life becomes much easier, I said quietly, when people stop assuming they are entitled to things that do not belong to them. Silence followed immediately. Not loud silence. Heavy silence. Vanessa blinked once, clearly surprised I had answered at all. Daniel forced a laugh that sounded brittle around the edges. Nobody said anyone was entitled. I looked at him, calmly beneath the ballroom lights. No, you only speak as though ownership has already transferred. His expression shifted then, irritation replacing charm for the first time that evening. I think you are overreacting. There it was. The oldest tactic in the world. Convince someone their discomfort is unreasonable instead of addressing the behavior causing it. I picked up my purse slowly from the chair. Perhaps, I replied softly. Or perhaps I am simply listening more carefully than I used to. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. Margaret, nobody here wants conflict. No, I answered while slipping the strap of my purse onto my shoulder. Conflict usually begins after people stop getting what they expected. Harold rose beside me without another word. Across the ballroom, the remaining staff had already begun clearing centerpieces from empty tables while the jazz musicians packed away instruments near the stage. The evening was ending, but something far more important had begun quietly beneath all the champagne and candlelight. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. Mom, if this is about tonight, it was just harmless joking around. I studied his face carefully then. My son, my only child, a man I once believed incapable of truly hurting me. And suddenly I realized something painful. He genuinely believed the problem was the joke itself, not the years of entitlement underneath it. Harmless things do not leave people feeling small afterward, I said quietly. His expression hardened slightly. You are taking this too personally. I almost smiled at that. Too personally. As though being reduced to a financial resource by your own family should somehow feel impersonal. Harold gently placed one hand against the back of my chair. Margaret, he said calmly, shall we go? I nodded once, and as I walked beside him toward the ballroom exit, I could feel Daniel and Vanessa watching me carefully for the first time all evening. Not with affection, not with gratitude, with uncertainty, because something had changed tonight, even if they could not fully identify it yet. For the first time in years, I had stopped behaving like someone afraid to disappoint them. The drive home from the country club felt strangely peaceful. Rain drifted softly across the windshield while the city lights blurred into long streaks of gold and white along the empty roads. Harold sat quietly in the passenger seat beside me, one hand resting over the leather folder on his lap. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. After an evening filled with carefully disguised manipulation and polished cruelty, silence felt honest. When we finally reached my neighborhood, the houses stood dark and still beneath the late autumn rain. I parked slowly in the driveway and turned off the engine, but neither of us moved immediately. The ticking sound of cooling metal filled the quiet car. Harold looked toward the house before speaking softly. Thomas loved this home. I followed his gaze toward the front porch where warm lantern lights glowed against the rain. He built most of it himself, I answered quietly. Every bookshelf, every cabinet in the study, even the garden walls. Harold nodded slowly, which is exactly why he protected it so carefully before he died. We stepped inside a few moments later, carrying the cold dampness of the evening with us. The familiar scent of cedar wood and old books wrapped around me immediately. Home. Real home. Not the expensive ballroom with its shallow laughter and strategic smiles. Harold placed the folder carefully on my dining room table while I moved toward the kitchen to prepare coffee. My hands no longer trembled the way they had earlier in the evening. Fear disappears quickly once confusion finally leaves the room. When I returned with 2 mugs, Harold had already removed several documents from the folder and spread them neatly across the table beneath the hanging light fixture. Legal language filled the pages in precise black print. Trust revisions, asset protections, property clauses. Years ago, those documents would have overwhelmed me. Tonight, they felt strangely comforting. Tangible proof that Thomas saw me clearly even when I did not see myself clearly. Margaret, Harold began carefully, there is something you need to understand fully before moving forward. I sat down slowly across from him. All right. He adjusted his glasses and rested one hand lightly against the papers. Everything remains under your authority. The house, the investment accounts, the trust distributions. Nothing transfers automatically to Daniel. I stared at him for a moment. He believes it does. Yes, Harold replied calmly. And I suspect Vanessa encouraged that assumption. Rain tapped steadily against the dining room windows while the grandfather clock echoed softly from the hallway. The house suddenly felt like it was listening with me. There is more, Harold continued. Thomas also documented concerns privately during the final year before his passing. My chest tightened slightly. What kind of concerns? Harold opened another section of the folder and slid a paper gently toward me. I recognized Thomas's handwriting immediately. Steady, clean, familiar enough to ache. Daniel increasingly treats Margaret's generosity as permanent obligation rather than voluntary kindness, the note read. Vanessa appears highly focused on asset positioning and future access. I lowered the paper slowly back onto the table. Seeing my husband's private thoughts written so plainly felt almost unbearable. Not because he was wrong, because he had been right for longer than I realized. Harold's voice softened. He did not write these things out of anger. No, I whispered. Out of worry. Harold nodded once. Exactly. We sat quietly for a long moment while rain continued falling outside. Then my phone suddenly lit up across the table. Daniel. I stared at the screen without answering immediately. The phone vibrated again almost instantly after it stopped. Then a text message appeared. Mom, I think tonight got weird for no reason. Vanessa feels terrible. We should clear this up tomorrow. I looked at the message carefully. Not one word asking whether I was hurt. Not one word apologizing for humiliating me publicly. Only concern about tension, about discomfort, about restoring control. Harold watched my expression quietly. You do not have to respond tonight. I set the phone face down on the table beside Thomas's handwritten notes. No, I said softly. I think for the first time in years, I finally understand that. Outside, thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the neighborhood, while warm light filled the dining room around us. And sitting there surrounded by legal documents, old memories, and the quiet truth my husband had tried to protect me from, I realized something important. Daniel and Vanessa still believed this story was about inheritance. They had no idea it had already become about dignity. The next morning arrived gray and heavy with rain clouds hanging low over the neighborhood. I woke before sunrise and sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands while Thomas's handwritten notes remained spread carefully across the polished wood beside me. I had not slept much, not because of fear anymore, but because clarity changes everything once it arrives. Memories I once defended now looked completely different under the light of truth. Around 8:30, my phone rang again. Daniel. This time I answered. Morning, Mom, he said quickly, his voice carrying forced warmth. I think we should all get together tonight and clear the air. Vanessa feels awful about how tense things became. I stared quietly through the rain-covered kitchen window toward the empty backyard. Does she? There was a small pause. Come on. You know how these events get. People joke around. Everyone was drinking. Interesting how disrespect always becomes humor after someone gets caught. What exactly are we clearing up? I asked calmly. Daniel sighed softly, already sounding irritated beneath the patience. Mom, nobody was trying to hurt you. But Harold showing up with trust paperwork in the middle of dinner made things unnecessarily uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. Again, his concerns centered around atmosphere. Optics, not the humiliation itself. I see, I replied quietly. So tonight is about making everyone comfortable again. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Can we please just have dinner like adults? I almost smiled at that. Like adults. As though maturity meant quietly accepting disrespect to preserve appearances. All right, I answered after a moment. What time? 7 o'clock. At our place. After we hung up, I remained seated for several minutes listening to the rain tapping gently against the windows. Then I reached for Thomas's note again and reread the final sentence near the bottom of the page. Kindness without boundaries eventually becomes permission. The words settled differently now than they would have years ago. Around noon, I drove downtown to meet Harold at his office. The building smelled faintly of leather, paper, and old wood polish, carrying the quiet seriousness of places where truth eventually catches up with people. Harold greeted me warmly before leading me into the conference room overlooking the city streets below. A thick folder already waited on the polished table beside several neatly organized documents. Margaret, he said carefully once we sat down. Before tonight happens, I believe you should fully understand your position. He opened the folder slowly and turned several pages toward me. Trust valuations, property ownership summaries, investment accounts. The numbers startled me despite everything. Thomas had managed our assets far more carefully than I realized during the final years of his life. Daniel believes the estate transitions automatically after your passing, Harold explained calmly. But the trust was structured differently. I looked up from the paperwork. How differently? Harold folded his hands together. Every major distribution remains conditional, including his. Silence settled heavily across the room. Meaning? I asked quietly. Harold's voice remained calm and precise. If the behavioral clause is triggered formally, Daniel forfeits access to nearly everything. My eyes drifted slowly back toward the papers. The house, the investments, the accounts Daniel clearly believed were already part of his future. Would Thomas really have done that to his own son? I whispered. Harold looked at me steadily. No, Margaret. Your husband did it for his son. He hoped accountability might force him to become someone better before it was too late. I swallowed carefully while staring out the rain-streaked windows toward the city below. Even now, Thomas had tried protecting Daniel from himself. And Vanessa? I asked after a moment. Harold's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She receives nothing independently. Her access exists entirely through Daniel's beneficiary status. I leaned back slowly in the chair while understanding settled fully into place for the first time. Everything about last night suddenly made sense. The pressure, the careful language, the fake concern about simplifying my life. They were not preparing for my future. They were securing theirs. Harold slid one final paper gently across the table toward me. If tonight escalates, he said softly, you have every legal right to formally invoke the clause immediately. I stared at the signature line waiting quietly at the bottom of the page. My name already typed neatly beside the date. For years, I believed strength meant enduring mistreatment silently in order to keep family together. Sitting there in Harold's office while rain darkened the city outside, I finally began understanding something Thomas tried desperately to teach me before he died. Sometimes the only way to save your dignity is to stop rewarding the people destroying it. Daniel and Vanessa's house sat glowing at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac when I arrived a little before 7 o'clock that evening. Warm light spilled from the large front windows while soft instrumental music drifted faintly through hidden outdoor speakers near the front porch. Everything looked welcoming from the outside. Beautiful homes often hide the coldest conversations. I sat in my car for a moment with my hands resting quietly on the steering wheel while rain misted softly against the windshield. Harold's folder remained beside me on the passenger seat. Inside it rested every truth Daniel still believed he could manipulate his way around. I finally stepped out into the cold evening air and walked slowly toward the front door. Vanessa opened it almost immediately, her smile polished and careful. Margaret, she said warmly while leaning forward to kiss my cheek. We are so glad you came. I looked past her into the house where candles flickered across the dining room table beneath a crystal chandelier. Daniel stood near the fireplace, pouring wine into 3 glasses with practiced calm. "Mom," he said brightly. "Thank you for coming over." He sounded relaxed. Too relaxed. Like a man confident the situation still remained under his control. Vanessa took my coat gently and hung it in the front hallway closet before guiding me toward the dining room. Everything had been arranged deliberately. Fresh flowers, fine china, my favorite roasted salmon recipe. Even the white linen napkins folded exactly the way I used to fold them during family holidays years ago. The performance of closeness had suddenly become very important to them. "This looks lovely," I said quietly while taking my seat. Vanessa smiled immediately. "We wanted tonight to feel comfortable." Comfortable. Another carefully chosen word. Daniel handed me a glass of wine before sitting across from me at the table. "Mom," he began smoothly. "I think things got emotional the other night, and everyone misunderstood each other." I lifted the wine glass slowly but did not drink. What exactly was misunderstood? His smile faltered slightly before returning. "The jokes. The comments. Nobody meant anything hurtful." Vanessa nodded quickly beside him. "We adore you, Margaret. You know that." Adore. Such a pretty word for people who discuss your future like a business transaction. Dinner arrived in careful stages. Polite conversation. Weather updates. Discussions about wedding planning and travel schedules. But underneath every sentence, tension moved quietly through the room like a hidden current. Daniel eventually leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "Mom, we really have been thinking about your future lately." There it was. Finally, I placed my fork neatly beside my plate. "My future. Only because we care," Vanessa added gently. "The house is large. The maintenance alone must be exhausting. And honestly," Daniel continued, "it would make sense to start consolidating assets now while everything is uncomplicated." I looked at him steadily. Uncomplicated for who? Silence settled briefly across the dining room. Daniel exhaled softly and reached for his wine glass. "Mom, you know eventually everything comes to me anyway. We are only trying to plan responsibly." Eventually everything comes to me anyway. There was at last. Not concern. Not care. Assumption. Ownership spoken aloud without realizing it. I stared at my son across the candlelit table while the rain tapped softly against the windows behind him. He genuinely believed my life had already become part of his financial future. Vanessa leaned forward carefully. "We even toured a beautiful senior community last month near Naples. It has private gardens, wellness programs, ocean views. You would love it there." My heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. They had already toured places for me without ever asking whether I planned to leave my home. "You toured retirement communities?" I asked calmly. Vanessa smiled cautiously. "Just exploring possibilities." Daniel nodded. "We are trying to think ahead before things become difficult unexpectedly." I almost smiled then because suddenly everything felt painfully clear. The house, the trust, the pressure, the fake concern wrapped carefully in soft language. They were not inviting me into future plans. They were preparing to remove me from the center of them. Slowly, I reached into my purse and placed Harold's folder gently onto the dining room table between us. The room became very still. Daniel frowned immediately. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her wine glass. "What is that?" Daniel asked carefully. I rested one hand calmly against the folder while meeting my son's eyes across the candlelight. "Something your father wanted both of you to understand before either of you made any more plans for my life." Daniel stared at the folder in front of me as though it might suddenly disappear if nobody touched it. The candlelight flickered softly across the dining room while rain continued tapping against the windows behind us. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Vanessa finally broke the silence first. "Margaret," she said carefully, "what exactly is this?" I opened the folder slowly and removed the top document before placing it neatly on the table between us. "Your father updated the family trust 6 months before he passed away," I said quietly while looking directly at Daniel. His expression tightened immediately. "Updated it how?" I slid the paper closer toward him. "By adding conditions." Daniel picked up the document with visible irritation already rising beneath his calm expression. His eyes moved quickly across the page before suddenly stopping. The confidence disappeared from his face almost instantly. Vanessa leaned closer beside him. reading over his shoulder while her posture slowly stiffened. Neither of them looked at me anymore. They only stared at the words. Public humiliation, financial exploitation, revocation of inheritance rights. The room became so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking faintly from the hallway. "This is ridiculous," Daniel said finally, though his voice lacked certainty now. "Dad would never do something like this." "He already did," I answered calmly. Vanessa straightened in her chair quickly. "Margaret, nobody has exploited you." I folded my hands quietly together in my lap. "You toured retirement communities without speaking to me first." Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but I continued before she could. "You discussed simplifying my assets before asking whether I wanted anything simplified. And Daniel publicly referred to me as your family's personal ATM in front of 50 guests." Daniel exhaled sharply and tossed the paper back onto the table. "It was a joke." "No," I replied softly. "It was the truth," said carelessly. His jaw tightened immediately. "You are seriously going to threaten me with inheritance over one stupid comment?" I looked at him quietly across the candlelit table. This was never about one comment. Silence settled over the room again. Heavy this time. Final. Vanessa's voice softened suddenly, becoming almost pleading. "Margaret, we love you." I held her gaze calmly. "You love access." The sentence landed harder than shouting ever could have. Daniel stood abruptly from his chair and began pacing beside the dining room table. "Unbelievable," he muttered while dragging one hand through his hair. "After everything we have done for you." I almost smiled sadly at that. Done for me. As though allowing me near my own family counted as generosity. "What exactly have you done for me, Daniel?" I asked. Quietly. He stopped walking. "We include you in our lives." There it was. The truth finally exposed completely. Inclusion had become transactional. Conditional. Something granted in exchange for financial support. I reached into the folder once more and removed Thomas's handwritten note before sliding it gently across the table toward my son. Daniel hesitated before picking it up. As he read silently, I watched something shift slowly across his face. Not guilt. Recognition. Because for the first time, he was hearing his father's disappointment directly instead of through me. Vanessa read over his shoulder again, her expression tightening further with every line. "Dad wrote this?" Daniel asked quietly. "Yes," I answered. He saw what was happening long before I did. Daniel lowered the paper slowly back onto the table while avoiding my eyes completely now. The arrogance from earlier had vanished. So had the polished confidence. All that remained was discomfort colliding with consequences. I stood carefully from my chair and reached for my coat, hanging beside the dining room entrance. Neither of them tried stopping me immediately. "Mom," Daniel said finally, his voice quieter now. "You are really willing to do this?" I looked at my son one last time beneath the warm dining room lights. The little boy who once held my hand crossing parking lots. The teenager who cried after his first heartbreak. The man who somehow learned to measure love through access and entitlement instead of gratitude. "No," I said softly while slipping my coat over my shoulders. "You already did this yourselves." Vanessa lowered her eyes toward the table. Daniel said nothing more. There was nothing left to argue about once truth entered the room fully. I picked up the folder calmly and walked toward the front door while rain whispered softly against the windows outside. And for the first time in many years, I did not feel abandoned walking away from my family. I felt free. Because money can replace comfort. It can replace homes, cars, vacations, even reputations sometimes. But once respect disappears inside a family, no inheritance on earth can buy it back.